Welcome to the Nonprofit Pod. I'm Melissa, a university professor who specializes in nonprofits and who loves to yap about nonprofits. This week, we're going to dive into some of the most impactful stories this week from the nonprofit sector. From leadership controversy to the resurgence of volunteerism and the complexities of funding in today's unusual political climate, we're going to dive into the stories making headlines. First, let's talk about a little bit of unfortunate nonprofit news, which is a New York City nonprofit CEO being indicted for a $2.5 million bribery scheme. Our first story takes us to New York City, where Julio Medina, the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Exodus Transitional Community, has been indicted for accepting $2.5 million in bribes. Prosecutors allege that Medina directed $51 million in COVID-19 relief funds to businesses owned by his co-defendants in exchange for luxury car payments, cash, and real estate. Exodus Transitional Community had received $122 million from the city for the purpose of managing hotels for inmates during the pandemic. Now, all three individuals face serious charges, including potential prison sentences for up to 45 years. In this case, it underscores the critical need for board oversight, transparency, and accountability within nonprofit organizations, especially those that are in charge of managing substantial public funds. Now, ethics and trustworthiness are critical topics in the nonprofit sector. There's actually something called the moral disillusionment theory that tells us that nonprofits are held to a higher degree of standards, expectations, and scrutiny than for-profit businesses. So when an ethical breach happens in the nonprofit sector, they're held and judged much more harshly. While most folks in nonprofits are good-hearted, well-intended people, there are, unfortunately, as we've learned from this case, some bad actors that should have had a lot more oversight. I have some great resources and articles on how to model ethical behavior in nonprofit organizations and provide that oversight, and I'll drop that below in the comments. Shifting to a little bit of good news, volunteers are returning now to nonprofits post-pandemic. This is really awesome. I know that post-pandemic, it was really difficult to try to harness the power of volunteers. When I worked in the sector right after coming out of the COVID pandemic, it's like crickets. We needed volunteers. They were nowhere to be found. The good news is a survey by the U.S. Census Bureau and AmeriCorps indicated that 28.3% of Americans, which is about 76 million people, volunteered with nonprofits from September 2022 to September 2023. Now, this is a nice increase. It's about a 23.2% increase over 2021 numbers, but we're still falling below some pre-pandemic levels of volunteerism. And nonprofits, of course, rely heavily on volunteer labor. And if you actually put a number on that, that labor is valued at about $33 per hour. And nonprofits have seen diverse participation across states, with Utah and Vermont leading at over 40%. So they have a much stronger volunteer base. Now, the resurgence of volunteerism, it's vital for nonprofits to continue their missions effectively, especially since many are still navigating a lot of challenges post-pandemic. So if you want resources on how to manage volunteers and how to recruit, train, and retain volunteers, I'll drop those down in the comments. Next is the chaos that is being sowed by the federal funding freeze. In a controversial move, a federal judge has temporarily halted President Trump's decision to freeze federal grants and loans. And this is having a huge impact on the nonprofit sector. It's estimated that there are $3 to $10 trillion spent by the government on nonprofit funds in 2024. Now, the freeze is aimed to eliminate funding for programs considered Marxist, transgender inclusive as part of the Green New Deal, and other initiatives. And this has caused absolute panic in this sector because various payments, especially for Medicaid, were suspended. Democrats and state officials have voiced concerns over the freeze, emphasizing the halt's potential harm to essential services and health programs. Now, there have been a flurry of lawsuits that are filed by multiple organizations, leading to further scrutiny of the freeze. But this situation highlights the precarious nature of nonprofit funding sometimes, especially in such a volatile political climate. Next is mismanagement in New York City's homeless services. A report by the Department of Investigations has uncovered substantial misuse of taxpayer funds by nonprofit shelter organizations in New York City. New York, what is up with your nonprofit leadership? And this report revealed excessive executive pay and nepotism. Key offenders include CEOs of Acacia Network Housing and CORE, who received salaries of $916,000 to $1 million respectively. Now, side note, I actually think nonprofit employees are not paid enough, so I get in a little bit of a soapbox when it comes to scrutiny about how much nonprofits are paid. But there's a lot of question here about whether or not this is overcompensation, but that's debatable. Anyway, CORE CEO Jack Brown was found to have stacked the organization's payroll with associates and created for-profit vendors benefiting him personally financially, obviously a huge conflict of interest. Nonprofit Sebco Development Inc. misused $11.6 million in taxpayer money for services from a company it owned, double dipping by paying executives from both entities. This situation just underscores the need for, again, tighter oversight, more transparency, and more accountability in the nonprofit sector. Next are challenges in the media industry and how that impacts nonprofit news. The media industry is facing some huge challenges right now amid evolving business models and declining public trust. Insights from 57 influential media figures highlight efforts to sustain legacy institutions, to build new media companies, and individual brands through newsletter or audio. Now, the discussion examines the impact of social media platforms and a shift towards subscription-based services as those necessary and critical revenue sources. Observations from media executives emphasize deep changes in journalism, including pressures from artificial intelligence, over-reliance on social media, and some cultural and business shifts within media organizations. Now, despite the dire state, there does remain optimism about innovation and transformation within the media landscape. But the situation has direct implication for nonprofit news organizations that are striving and struggling to adapt and to thrive in an environment which is constantly changing. So that's a wrap on this week's nonprofit industry news. From leadership scandals and funding challenges to the heartening return of volunteers, which is the good part, the sector continues to navigate a complex landscape. Working in nonprofits, it's hard, y'all. It's not for the faint of heart. So to all of you that are out there doing the work, I commend you. If you found this information helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and be sure to check out my website, thenonprofitprof.com, for free resources, including online leadership courses for nonprofit employees. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.